Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this webinar entitled Empowering People with Criminal Records to Change Policy, a Legal Advocate's Guide to Storytelling. My name is Alex Lessman, Policy Analyst for the Criminal Records Project at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. The Council of State Governments Justice Center provides practical, nonpartisan, research-driven strategies and tools to increase public safety and strengthen communities. Before getting started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping points about how the webinar works. If you encounter any technical problems, including audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. That number again, 866-229-3239. This information will also be located in the chat box on your screen. Please understand that there may be some individual technical problems we cannot resolve. For this reason, we are recording this webinar and will post it on our website at cleanslateclearinghouse.org, where it will remain accessible. At any time during this webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A box at the right of your screen. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will reply to technical questions as we go. For content-related questions, we will keep a running list, and the presenters will address them at the end of the webinar. We will do our best to get through as many questions as possible. Today's presenters are Caitlin Brown, Communications Director at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, Sharon Dietrich, Litigation Director at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, and Ronald Lewis, Storyteller and business owner. We will be hearing from them shortly. This webinar is part of the Clean Slate Clearinghouse, a project funded by the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of Justice. The Clean Slate Clearinghouse was created to support juvenile and adult criminal record clearance around the country by, first, providing up-to-date information on record clearance as well as contact information for legal service providers in all U.S. states and territories. Second, developing tools and resources for legal service providers currently doing record clearance work or those who want to expand their record clearance services. And third, providing information to compare record clearance policies across jurisdictions and to learn about best practices. The site was designed to serve three target audiences: people with criminal records who are seeking to have their records cleared, legal service providers who offer record clearance services, and policymakers and stakeholders who want to compare record clearance policies across the country. The site is also useful for reentry and workforce service providers who can connect people to services, indigent defense attorneys, and pro bono attorneys who are interested in starting or expanding record clearance practice, and researchers and journalists who want to compare trends in record clearance legislation across the country. The primary goals of the Clean Slate Clearinghouse are to provide accessible, up-to-date information for record clearance policies across the country and to increase the capacity of legal service providers while creating a community of practice for those doing record clearance work. We encourage you to visit the website and sign up for our newsletter to stay updated on news, events, and webinars such as this one. Now, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Caitlin Brown.
Hi everyone, this is Caitlin Brown. I'm the Communications Director at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. In today's webinar, we're going to cover a few things. We're going to talk about why storytelling is so important. You're going to hear from a storyteller, Ronald. We're going to talk about the ways that you can do storytelling without doing any harm. We're going to talk about how to choose a client, how to work with the media, and practical ways of telling stories. So why tell stories? Messaging is just much more memorable memorable and powerful than using talking points alone. Studies have shown that people remember stories 22 times more than facts alone. So if we want people to remember the information we tell them, storytelling is a great way of doing that. So you want to do stories and substantive information together to make powerful change. Storytelling has a lot of benefits to it. A lot of times in our advocacy, we want people to take action. We want them to call a lawmaker. We want them to speak out about something. When we do advocacy, we want people to remember what we're talking about and be inspired by injustice so that they can take action. And storytelling helps us do that. Lawmakers are often persuaded by stories. We've had times where lawmakers will actually ask us for stories of people who have been impacted by criminal records or some other injustice. They take those stories with them to the Capitol or to wherever they are. They tell those stories, and it helps them take action too. A lot of times storytelling can help clients, and when I say clients, I really am talking about anyone who's impacted by the justice system, but at COS we work with clients, so that's the phrase, or that's the word I'm going to use to talk about that. Storytelling can help clients more easily understand information. When people relate to somebody, it helps them to understand, it helps them to remember, so storytelling is a great way to do that. A really, really important thing here is that storytelling empowers the storyteller to speak their truth. Somewhere along the line, your client, your storyteller, they weren't believed. They wanted to have a job, but someone believed they weren't qualified or someone believed they didn't deserve it. Maybe someone believed that they couldn't be a good mom or dad. Maybe they have a record and they didn't even do anything wrong and nobody believes them. But somewhere along the line, they weren't believed. And so when you do storytelling, when you give them a chance to tell their story, you're saying, I believe in you, I believe you, and you're letting other people believe them too. So that's really important. And the other thing is that there are a lot of myths and misinformation about people with criminal records. And so when you get their voices out there, you can combat those stereotypes and you can correct the record. So I'm really excited that today we actually have a storyteller with us, Ronald. We're going to watch a short video with Ronald, and then we're going to do some Q&A. And now we're going to hear from Ronald Lewis and from CLS Litigation Director Sharon Dietrich a short conversation about how Ronald has had this experience telling his story and the ways that he's benefited from it.
Hello, everyone. This is Sharon Dietrich. Ronald, are you there? Ronald, are you there?
We are searching. I think he may have gotten disconnected, so let me search one moment.
While we're trying to get Ronald on the phone, let me tell you that the video that we just saw is available on the Center for American Progress's website. I'm sorry, our ability technologically to bring that to you is not all it might have been, but you can see it's a short video that is powerful, and if you want to hear it in Ronald's voice, go to the Center for American Progress's website and you will have a chance to do that.
Ronald, are you on the line?
Hello?
Hey, hi, thank you. Got you.
Okay. I heard y'all. Y'all couldn't hear me. I heard y'all. Y'all couldn't hear me.
Okay, great. Hi, Ronald. We thought we would interview you quickly for you to talk to people not only about your own story, but what it's like to be a storyteller and how that has affected your life. So let me start by asking you to tell folks about what's on your record and how that record has affected you.
Well, and what's on my record, I have 2 misdemeanors, one for retail theft and one for conspiracy that happened in 2004. The way it has affected me is it has hindered me and made life a little challenging as far as employment, things as you wouldn't think it would affect as small as me taking my kids on class trips, education, business ventures. So it made it real difficult in my life to progress in life when you have a criminal background.
And if you could give folks an idea of some of the problems you've encountered with applying for jobs based on your record.
Oh, employment, you get the job. They interview you, you're the ideal candidate until till the criminal background comes back, and then they look at you like, we can't hurry up to getting you out the building, or as soon as you, anything when it's criminal related, once they hear that you have some of your background, the whole complexion of the conversation changes. They're real difficult and challenging.
You've even been removed from jobs you were already holding, is that right?
Correct. I had my first engineering job actually out of school. You think life is about to change for you. So I worked on this job for maybe a little over a month, and they called me in the office, HR, one day, and said something came back on your record. I said, well, I was honest. I wrote everything down. She said, well, we're not going to be able to keep you employed here, but you can have a book bag and a mug, and that was devastating to go home and tell your family once you think you turned the corner, and to know that you haven't turned the corner, and society and things like that won't let you leave the past in the past is devastating.
So you've been working with me for quite a long time, right?
Yes. About 10 years.
And in
plus.
a long time. And in December of 2014, I approached you about speaking at an event in Washington for a paper that Rebecca Vallis at the Center for American Progress and I were releasing, and you agreed to do that. Was
Correct,
that your first time you spoke in public about your record?
Yeah, that's the first time I spoke, period, because I'm really a reserved person, and I was hesitant to do it because, like I said, I'm not really one that gets up and speaks, but when I had to think about all the people that this can possibly help it was bigger than Ronald Lewis and bigger than any little fears I had of speaking, so I was all in.
And so what was the experience like for you?
Nervous, scared, and then after I got a few words out, it became, oh, I can do this. I can do this, and this can help millions and millions of people if we can get this bill passed. So after the nerves, as I got past the nerves part, it was like, this is maybe what I'm here to do. Sometimes it's not really about specifically you. You have to I removed the ego and the selfishness of just helping Ronald Lewis and what impact I can have on the world, and I was all in.
And since that time in Washington, you have become one of the faces of Clean Slate in Pennsylvania, right, and had many more opportunities to do speaking engagements like that.
Yes.
Talk about some of the other opportunities that you've had to tell your story, to try to help make a difference.
We did an event for Malcolm Jenkins. We also did a event at Georgetown. We did a couple PVC for Channel 12 documentaries. We just did another documentary about maybe 2 months ago. I can't remember who we did it for. I did like radio interviews. We did countless things to try to get Clean Slate out and get more awareness of it.
So right after the event in Washington, we had you go on national TV, right, with PBS to tell your story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. On my birthday.
On your birthday. And Malcolm Jenkins, for people who don't know, is a player with the Philadelphia Eagles who has taken up these issues, right?
Yes, correct. Yes.
And just this week, we had you speak at the Capitol in Harrisburg about your experience to support our Clean Slate legislative campaign, right?
Yes, we did, yes.
What was that like to be in such a big, ornate place with all the VIPs that were part of that?
It was, let's take your time and let's get this, let them know the importance of what this bill represents and how important it is to pass this bill and how many lives it truly affects and how, I mean, negatively, but how many people it can affect positively if we can pass that bill. It was a great experience.
So what impact has this telling of your story had on your life?
The impact it has on my life is that people that once had no hope, because people, they always used to being disappointed. And a lot of times people that I run to, once they have a criminal background, regardless how minor it is, it's like a life sentence. They think they committed a crime and nobody's ever going to help them. So by me having a conversation or they see me talking, they see that it's some kind of hope and we're pushing for change. We're pushing for second chance. So that's how it changed my life.
And how has your family responded to your doing this?
Oh, my family's very proud. My family is very proud.
What's your favorite part in being involved in these kinds of events over the last couple of years?
The possibility of to help change lives. That's it. I just want to help change lives.
Has there been anything about your doing this that you've regretted? Has your story ever come back on you in a negative way or anything like that?
If it has, it hasn't reached my doorstep, so no. I think people like my story just because it's authentic, it's real, and they feel that I'm not just up there trying to get a camera shot. They really feel like I want change, we want change, so the cause is great.
Now, you've been filmed in your home. In fact, we showed that little film that Rebecca just made before you came on the phone. How did you feel about filming in your home? Did that feel invasive of your privacy or your family's privacy?
Well, of course, initially you go through them feelings, but when you have a support system like I have, and they know what the common goal is, and they're on the same accord as you as far as the common goal then it makes it that much easier.
All right. I think that's all the questions I have. I know that others may want to ask you some questions. We're going to hold for a minute to see if they want to do that. You should email your question in, folks, out there, if you want to ask Ronald a question, because we're going to release him to go back to work in a couple of minutes. Maybe while we're doing that, Ronald, you could tell people about how you came to be a business owner.
Actually, I have been, like I said, turned down so many times, and me and my partner worked at we worked at a lot of big firms as far as doing the HVAC, and I was thinking. Then once I started really doing the speaking, and always wanted to get back, so I used to coach at somewhere called CPN, Extreme Parent Network. So I always had a knack of helping people. So when we sat down to figure what can we do, we both was good at HVAC. So we figured what can we do and how can I implement this. Once we sat down, I was saying anything that I'm involved in, it has to implement this some type of way and be able to give second chances to ourselves. By me being turned down so many times, I wanted to kind of take the power out of everybody's hand and dictate my own as far as I'm going to give second chances. So like I started a company called DeWitt Heating and Air Conditioning. And we give second chances, and that's how DeWitt came about. One of the ways DeWitt came about.
That's terrific. Alex, do we have questions?
We do. One question that has come in for Ronald Lewis is, were there specific things Sharon did to help you prepare to tell your story that were the most helpful for you?
Just be Sharon. We talk process and really just listen to me and let me tell my story and not change my story, but critique certain things that will help me get my story across even better, if that makes any sense.
Like talking points and stuff.
Absolutely, yes.
And here's a variation on that question. It says, how do you think attorneys can help people tell their stories? And the questioner notes that attorneys tend to talk too much and not listen enough.
Hey, I didn't hear, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Can you say it again, please?
Sure. It's how do you think attorneys can help individuals tell their stories? And the questioner notes that attorneys tend to talk too much and not listen enough.
That's it. Be more listeners, and really, a lot of times people want somebody to hear them, and not just hear them. They want them to hear them. When I sit down and tell you my story, I don't want you to say or not pay attention to it, because it takes a lot for me to get up here and tell the story anyway. Because where we come from, like I said, we feel like nobody listens to us. So when you listen to people, they tend to open up a little more. So I think if attorneys be more of a listener, and be more like the human part of it, have the more human part of it, then people will open up, and I think that's the way.
The next one is, did Mr. Lewis face any challenges based on his criminal record for getting a small business loan?
No challenges on a business loan, but I don't really have too many loans. A lot of things are really funded myself. So, but I do face still to this day challenges or getting contracts. That's the biggest challenges I have now, getting certain contracts.
Like government contracts, right?
Government contracts with stores, things of that nature.
We also have a question about getting in touch with you, Ronald, and what are the requirements to work for your company. There will be email addresses up on the screen at the end of the presentation, so that can be done afterwards.
The basic requirements are basically going to school for heating and air conditioning or electrical, having some type of paperwork, and wanting to know how, somebody that's ambitious and wanting to learn something. That's basically it. And then I sit down and have a conversation with you and see what your thinking is.
That's all the questions we have right now.
Ronald, thank you for sharing your time and your story yet again. Folks, this is the second time Ronald has helped us in a single week. He came to Harrisburg with us on Monday to tell his story to the General Assembly, and we can't thank him enough, and we sure as heck could not do this without him.
It's not a problem. I'm honored to do it, and like I said, it's for a common goal that's bigger than all of us, and let's just change lives. Let's continue working, and I'm here. I'm going to make myself available as much as I can, and let's just do it. Let's try to leave our impact on the world.
Thanks, Ronald.
Bye.
Okay, so this is Caitlin again. Now we're going to talk about, now that you know how great it is to tell stories, how important it is to the storyteller and to your advocacy, now we're going to talk about important things like not doing any harm to your clients. So once you've told a story, it can't be undone. If it's out there in the public, it's out there forever. And so we really want to be very cautious about a few things before moving forward. You definitely want to think about the pros and cons of this particular individual and their story before sharing anything. So the first thing you want to do is you want to obtain consent for your client before you share confidential information with anyone. You'll want to use a consent form that is straightforward and understandable, not a lot of legalese. We've actually released a paper that goes along with this webinar, and the link to that paper will be at the end of this presentation. In the paper, there is a sample consent form, so you can take a look at that. One consideration is whether or not your client can truly consent to sharing their story. So somebody who has intellectual disabilities, somebody who's been through a lot of trauma, you want to make sure that they are actually able to provide consent before moving forward. The other thing you want to be sure of is that your client is choosing to share their story and they're not feeling coerced. So if you've represented a client and they haven't had to pay anything, they might feel like they owe you something. You want to make sure that that's not why they're sharing their story, that if they are sharing their story, they're doing it enthusiastically and not because they feel pressured into doing it. You really want to protect your storyteller's privacy. This is really important, especially for people with criminal records. So if somebody has a criminal record and they're applying for a job and you can Google them and find a news article about their criminal record, that's going to hurt them. So you really want to make sure that you are avoiding any identifying information. And that includes their name, but it also includes facts of the case, what their living situation is, or anything that makes them unique. So if a person has a criminal record, try to ensure that their full name is not used in any media story, in any newsletter that you're putting out, in anything that's public. A lot of times reporters will agree to use a pseudonym or just the first name of somebody if that person would face legal problems if identified. And so if you explain to a reporter, hey, using their name, their full name can hurt their chances of getting a job or housing or educational opportunities, a lot of times the reporter will agree to not use their full name. You get that agreement before you provide a reporter with the storyteller's full name and contact information. We'll talk a little bit more about the process for doing that later on in the webinar. So you really want to be careful about where the interview takes place, especially if there are cameras or video cameras present. Even if your client agrees to be recorded on video or photographed, other people around them might not agree to that and might feel very uncomfortable about that. So if you have a client who is experiencing homelessness as a result of their criminal record and you want to do a story about that, you probably don't want to bring a video camera to a homeless shelter because there are other people there, and even if those people are not filmed, they might be scared of the camera, there might be a reason why they want to be anonymous. And so you really want to be careful about where the story takes place, where the interview takes place, and the privacy of other people around them. Likewise, family members living in the house may not want to be identified and may not want to be involved with the story. And so you want to be very careful to make sure that they're not photographed or named. All right, so when you are working with the media or sharing a story, you also have to make sure that you're seeing the legal implications for a client. So you may have a client who is not in the best living conditions and lives with children. If you do a story where there's an interview in their home and there are photographs, do you risk having the children taken away by child welfare because of the living conditions? Those are the kind of things that you want to think about. You really want to think about if any kind of legal case could be harmed by doing communication. You really want to think, could it create a different legal problem for your client? Could it exacerbate a problem they already have? These are the kind of things that you absolutely must think about before doing any communication. You want to evaluate the entire picture. If there is a confidentiality agreement on the case, you absolutely need to follow the requirements set out in that agreement. You may have the absolute perfect story. You may have the person who can tell the story, the very best in the whole wide world. But if there is a confidentiality agreement on the case, or if it's an active case, you absolutely need to consider that, and you absolutely need to follow your ethical obligations here. Okay. So here are the steps you want to take when you're presenting your story, and you really want to do it in this order. So first thing is have the client sign a consent form. There are different points in the case or in your relationship with them where you can do that. My recommendation is that if you started to build a relationship with them at some point during their case, then I think that's an okay time to get them to sign a form. The benefit of doing that is that if you very suddenly need a client's story, you already have it. You don't need to wait until the case is finished. The downside is that the case is not finished yet, and as we previously discussed, there's a lot of considerations that go into that. A lot of times people wait until they've had an outcome on a case, and then they get the client to sign the form. This is the kind of thing where I think you want to try to get them to sign it as soon as you can, rather than waiting until you need a story, because it could take a little while to get them to sign the form if you have to mail it to them and have them mail it back. So I think, if you're going to see the person, that's a good time to get them to sign the form. Otherwise, try to do it well before you actually need to share a story. So you might want to have them sign a form if you think at any point in time their story will be good, rather than waiting until the moment where a reporter calls and asks if you have a client. You want to develop talking points with your storyteller, and you want to practice the interview. You want to find a reporter who is reporting on similar issues and who will report the story well. You want to email with the reporter before providing the storyteller's information. You want to get that agreement first that they're not going to use the full name. Then you want to connect the storyteller and the reporter, and then you want to accompany the storyteller on the interview. So let's talk a little bit about all of that. First thing you want to do is you want to choose a good storyteller. So a lot of times the instinct is to go with a person who has the most sympathetic, perfect life. None of us have a perfect life. I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find somebody who's, every step of the way has had this perfect, sympathetic life. That said, I think you want someone that people can relate to. You want somebody who is going to be relatable to whoever your target audience is, whether that's lawmakers, the general public. You want to really assess the pros and cons of who the person is, knowing that you're not going to get the perfect person, but you can get somebody who is very relatable. And even if you have the most sympathetic storyteller in the world, if they don't quite fit with the issue, if you're sort of forcing it, then they're not the right storyteller. They absolutely must tell the story that needs to be told. You want to prep your storyteller. So truly the easiest way to control the narrative is if it's in written format and if you help them write it. I think that's the way that you can get the points across the easiest. It's not necessarily the most powerful, but sometimes you just want to control that narrative. I think if you're writing something, the best thing to do is have the storyteller review it and give input if possible, because you really want to give them agency to tell their story. You don't want to be the one telling their story for them. You want to be working with them to tell the story. But we're really going to talk about a lot of times where it's a media interview or some other thing where they're doing the speaking. So anybody who tells their story needs to be prepared for backlash. A lot of times the comment sections of news media websites, there are a lot of people who are really unsympathetic there. There are a lot of people who say nasty comments, Anytime someone shares their story, they need to be prepared for that, and you should probably warn them against reading the comments on a news article. All right, so what you definitely want to do, and Ronald indicated this as well, is that you really want to practice with your client. You want to prepare them for public statements. So even though the storyteller, they know their own story, they know what their life is, they haven't practiced telling their story. And so you should really work with them to make sure that they can tell their story clearly. And you should be with them anyway, even if they're fully prepared, if there's an interview. So that if a reporter asks questions that are not relevant, if a reporter asks questions that are digging in too deep, if a reporter throws curveballs, you're there to protect your client. You want to have your talking points ready, and you want to have these written down. So whatever the story is that you want to tell, you should be trying to get a few key points across, and you should truly write them down. And that way, if a client is being interviewed, you know which points you always want to come back to. Or if the client is having their story shared with the legislature or something like that, these key points are going to drive the narrative. So write them down. Think about what it is you want to say and what you want to get across, and have those talking points prepared. One of the greatest things that Ronald has said while he's done communications is that he's had the door shut in his face so many times he knows what wood tastes like. That's a great quote because it says exactly what he is feeling. It's memorable, it's quotable. So it's not just what you say, but it's how you say it. When you are working with your storyteller and you're putting down talking points, it's actually helpful to write down a sentence or two that's quotable, that could be said in the interview. Reporters really love sound bites, and you really want to have one that's written down and ready to go that you can share in that moment. And this is one where you really want to make sure that it's coming from the client and not just from you. As much as it's tempting to say the perfect line and get quoted, it's much more important that your client is the one who gets quoted and your client is the one who speaks. So work with them to prepare that perfect soundbite. So we talked a little bit about writing down talking points. What you really want to do before you even do that is think about what the key points are that you want to convey. So if you're trying to convince people that a person with a criminal record deserves a second chance, maybe you want to talk about the ways that they have moved on from their record. Maybe you want to talk about if they're qualified for a job, what makes them qualified for that job. You really want to think about what it is you're trying to do, and then you want to drive your talking points around that. So we have worked with people who have criminal records who have been shut out of educational opportunities, and so we developed their talking points around how qualified they are to go to college and how intimidated they were by having a criminal records question on the application and the ways that their record has held them back. So we develop those as our key points that we want to convey. We write down the talking points, and we work with the clients to make sure that during an interview, those are the talking points that they are indicating to the reporter. So one of the things that you want to think about are the ways that myths and information persist so that you can combat those. So if there's something that reporters commonly get wrong about people with criminal records, you want to make sure that you have a talking point to combat that. If there are certain myths that are perpetuated, you want to make sure that you have something that goes against that. So, for example, juvenile records, a lot of times people think that they disappear once you turn 18. So if you're working with a client who has a juvenile record, you want to make sure that they have a talking point around how, hey, this didn't disappear, it's impacting me as an adult. Because that's a myth that people commonly get wrong. If the myth that you want to combat is that people, once they've committed a crime, always commit crimes, which we all know to be untrue. We all know on this call to be untrue. People don't know that necessarily. You want to make sure that you talk about redemption or the ways that they've moved forward with their lives. You want to paint a picture of the whole person, not just their record. So now you want to connect with the press. You want to try to connect your client's story with something bigger. It might be that you are issuing a report that goes along with it. It might be that there is a certain bill that's been introduced and you want to, cite it or move it along, the direction. You know, that's a bigger issue. And you can also just take a story and you can, you know, try to find something to connect it to. So we just had Father's Day. Maybe you've got a story about someone with a criminal record who is a good father but can't get a job because of their record, and you want to do a story about, you know, hey, it's Father's Day, and look at all these people who are trying to provide for their families but can't because of their record. That's a great trend to connect it to. So think about what's happening around you, take a look at the calendar, and try to connect it to a bigger trend, because journalists are more likely to be interested that way. You want to research a reporter before you work with them. If a reporter cold calls you, what you should be doing is asking them what their deadline is and saying, I'll call you back, and then you should research them and work on your talking points before you call them back. That's why it's really good if you're working with a client to try to develop talking points while you're working with them before their story is needed. But if you can't, at the very least what you should be doing is really making sure that you're not just picking up the phone and doing an interview right there. You want to have time to do some research. So if you decide you want to work with a reporter, or if you get a call from a reporter, you should take a look at their reporting to see have they reported on this issue before or something similar. Do the articles tend to be sympathetic to people with criminal records or to people in your client's population? And if they haven't written on the issue, at the very least, you should hop on social media. Journalists love Twitter. They're all on it. And take a look at their social media and see, in general, what are they like? What do they say about people with records? What do they say about people living in poverty? What do they say about people who have been marginalized? You can really get a lot from what their personal Twitter looks like. You can really get a lot about how they're going to write a story. So, if you see somebody who is perpetuating misinformation on their Twitter feed, they're probably not a good reporter to work with, and you should decline an interview or not pitch to them. Definitely do that research. It's really important. So you want to get an off-the-record confidentiality agreement from a journalist before sharing any information that should not be in print. So what I like to do is I like to send a short email to reporters and say, hey, I've got this great story. Here's what happened, and I don't put the client's name in there, and I don't put their contact information in there. I just do a short write-up of the story that doesn't identify any information about the client. And then I say, if you want to move forward, we need you to agree to only use their first name, or whatever the agreement is. You'll have to evaluate the case. You'll have to evaluate the situation to figure out what needs to be private. But you can get that agreement from the reporter, and then after you have the agreement, you share the information. A lot of times a reporter is going to ask for last name for verification purposes. When you email them with that last name, put in big, bold letters for verification only next to their full name. Something like that to indicate that you've agreed that it's going to be private. It's not going to show up in a story. Okay, so you have found a good reporter to work with. You've gotten the confidentiality agreement. You've been very careful about where you do the interview. You have prepped your client. You have put together talking points for them. You have helped them share their own story and made sure that they did most of the talking in the interview. You made sure that they had a great soundbite. You've done all of these things. Now you need to make sure that you are promoting it far and wide. So if your story is targeted at policymakers, don't assume that they've read it. Make sure that you email it to them or send out a blast to, all of the policymakers that you're trying to reach. Ask your partners to promote it and give it a signal boost so that it's reaching more people. Make sure that you are sharing it on your social media, in your newsletter, on your website. So you really want to, promote the story that you worked so hard to put out. Also, this isn't a one and done with your storyteller. As, Ronald has said, he has shared his story now countless times. But whether or not your storyteller wants to share their story countless times or just once, make sure you stay in contact with them. Make sure that if a news article or publication comes out, that you give it to the storyteller so that they get a copy of it. Ask them if they had a positive experience. Have a dialogue with them about what their experience was like. And yes, some storytellers may want to share their story again in the future, so keep in touch with them. Don't just reach out to them when you need their story to be shared, but just check in on them, build that relationship with them. All right, so here are the key takeaways that we've discussed today. Storytelling works. You can make powerful change by sharing stories. Storytellers can really benefit from sharing their stories. They feel empowered. It gives them a chance to help you out and help other people out. A lot of them really like to do it. A lot of them really benefit from it, just as Ronald has. But you have to think about consent, privacy, and protecting legal work when you are telling a story. And you want to develop talking points and be strategic about it, around the narrative, and make sure that whatever your goals are, your story fits in with those goals. Okay, and here is the link to our storytelling paper. So if you want to find that consent form, or if you want to read more about it, you can check out clsphila.org/storytelling. And here's all of our contact information. And now I think we can take some questions.
All right. Participants, feel free to write in your questions in the Q&A box. The first one we have is, have you ever had a reporter technically honor the agreement about the client but write a negative story about record stealing? If so, how did you handle it?
So I've never had that happen. I mean, I've had people who have written things that are, you know, not great. I've never had one that's written a really terrible one. And that's because I've also never shared a criminal record story with a reporter that I didn't know and trust. I have twice now had mix-ups where the reporter once forgot that they agreed not to use the last name, which is why I'm telling you, put in big, bold letters for verification only when you share that full name. Because, you know, this reporter truly forgot and fixed it right away and called me and called the client and apologized many times. And the name was taken down before the story went to print, and it was not a huge deal. But that is something that has happened. And another time it happened where we had asked a reporter not to share the client's name. The reporter went and asked the client, and because the client gave permission, the reporter went ahead and did share that name. And so we had to get the reporter to change their story, which is web only, and so luckily didn't go into print at all, which is why it's actually really important that you tell your clients, hey, we're not using your full name, and if the reporter asks to use your full name, say no. You really want to prep your client for that. So I've never had a situation where an agreement where they've gone back on an agreement on purpose, and I've never had a truly negative criminal record story. But again, that speaks to prepare and figuring out who the best reporters are.
The next question is, have you ever had a storyteller regret telling their story? And if so, how do you deal with that?
So I think, again, the way to really deal with that is to prepare them. I've had, while I've been at CLS, at least one example of somebody who was a named plaintiff on a case and didn't realize that their name was going to appear so many places. And so, you know, that's not quite the same thing, but I think it really speaks to making sure that the storyteller understands what is, like, which pieces of information are going to be public and what it means for information to be public. I think the more that you can prepare them and have them understand what it is, the easier it's going to be to deal with that, and the less likely they're going to regret something. So I've never had one where it's been in the news and there's been a real problem. Like I said, we had a couple instances where a name was shared on accident, but the reporter called and apologized profusely, and the person was still happy to share their story.
The next one is, how do you share the stories of minors?
That's a great question, and that's a really difficult question to answer. I mean, you know, obviously the thing that you do is you work with their parents. I think that, you know, if they're on the older side, it's much easier for them to understand what it means to share their story. We don't often share stories of truly young people. Sometimes we do with Social Security disability cases, and we work with the parents, and we make sure that everyone understands, what it means to share your story. I think that, what you have to do is you have to get parents to sign the consent form, but you also need to explain to the minor what it means to share their story, what it means to go public, what the implications are of that. I think, you have to treat them, as if they have the agency here, because they do, and you have to make sure that they are truly consenting to it and not just their parents, while at the same time getting their parents' legal consent.
The next is, what do you suggest is the best method to involve the media in a collaborative relationship in educating the public, specifically to reduce the stigma for individuals with a criminal history, particularly in a community that can be highly biased against them?
Well, I think there are a couple things there. One is that, if the community is highly biased against people with records, you really need to prepare the client for backlash. So we talked about how they shouldn't read the comments of a news article. I think that you want to, especially warn them of that if they're in a community that is, really biased. I think that if your client can agree to that, can understand that, people are not going to agree with them, I think the more you share stories, the more you are going to bust stigmas. I think that people, when they hear a story and they can connect with it, are much more likely to be sympathetic than to just facts. And so I think that the more that you can share stories with the media, the more likely you are to be able to convince people that, these stories matter and that people matter and that people have moved on from the record. Another thing I would say about that is that there have been studies recently that show that people are actually really persuaded by op-eds. We really think of people as not being able to be persuaded by much of anything, but actually, as it turns out, op-eds really are persuasive. And so this is one where, if you're in a community that tends to be biased and maybe there aren't a lot of journalists out there who will write a good story, you might want to work with your client to write an op-ed in their voice, because that might be a better way of doing it than connecting with the journalist. But I'm hoping that, in most communities there will be a journalist out there who will be sympathetic, and the more you can tell these stories, the more sympathetic other people are going to be.
If I could just add to that, this is Sharon. I think also that film sometimes does a better job showing people's lives and busting myths than print media. We once were involved in the making of a film about court debt that involved a lot of our clients in their homes and speaking about their lives. And in addition to addressing the substantive issue, many viewers found it profoundly moving and really experienced much better what the clients' lives were like. So now going on film is a whole other thing than going in print media. It is much more intrusive, but if clients are up for that, that can be a particularly good way to change minds, I think.
The next question is about the division of labor within the organization. Is it you, Caitlin, who works with the clients, or is it their attorney, or both?
Both. I think that, when I get a reporter who asks me for a client story or something like that, I work with the advocate. I have the advocate reach out to the client first. I'm not the first contact asking them to share their story, because they don't know me, and we want to have that relationship. And it's also, sometimes the client won't completely understand all of the ins and outs of the legal case, and so, I need an advocate to be there for that. That said, I'm really good at developing the talking points. I'm really good at trying to get the client to tell their story to somebody who they've never told their story to before because they don't know me. And so really it's the three of us will work together, myself, the client, and the advocate.
The next question is, have you experienced any bad reactions among decision makers or leaders to the stories you've put out there? And if so, what were the lessons learned?
That's a great question. I can't think of a time where that has happened. I mean, Sharon, do you have any experience with that?
I don't, and I think that's because the strategy of client storytelling really works for the most part. I'm not going to say it's impossible to have a bad reaction, but if a client is well prepared and tells their story well, people don't usually like to, and by people I mean the subject of the object of the communication, the General Assembly, the legislator, the policymaker. They don't want to usually criticize people themselves, especially if they're potentially constituents. So while they might be very willing to criticize me as an advocate for what I'm doing, in my experience, they usually don't go out of their way to criticize the individual.
All right, for attendees, this is your last chance to get a question in. Okay, here's a new one, and it is, are all of your attorneys trained in media relations? If so, is it by Caitlin or an outside coach?
We definitely do not have an outside coach. A lot of times when we have a certain issue, we have people who are assigned to work on that issue. I will sit down with them and talk about it. And the nice thing is, because I'm not an expert in any one issue, if they have to explain the issue to me and they can't explain it to me, it means they can't explain it to the general public. So that's the first thing we do, is make sure that we can get it out of legalese and into something that everybody can understand. I will sit down with our staff and I will mock interview them before they do an interview. A lot of times that's really helpful, and also it's really fun because I can throw them curveball questions that they're never going to get asked, but it's fun to watch them try to answer them. So nobody really has any kind of outside training, but we really work hard here to develop talking points and to practice before anyone gets interviewed.
All right. Thanks very much to our presenters today. If anyone has additional questions, you may email the presenters directly or email cleanslate@csgjusticecenter.org. We encourage you to sign up for our newsletter at cleanslateclearinghouse.org to receive information on future webinars and other announcements. We also encourage you to spread the word about the Clean Slate Clearinghouse in your networks. Thank you for joining the webinar today.